I'm not sure. I guess I need the mic for the live stream. Otherwise, it feels a little self-conscious standing here with a mic in front of 7 or 8 of us. I'm Sam Gregory. I'm the program director of the organization Witness. We're a global network of human rights activists and citizens movements that use video for human rights work. And what I wanted to share today is a little bit about two sides of the coin. How do you empower people to document violence against themselves and their communities? And I want to talk pretty broadly about violence. I want to talk about state violence, and I want to talk about violence by non-state actors, so other people in your community. And then I want to talk about strategies that look at what happens when people who are not doing it for positive purposes document violence against vulnerable individuals, and how we can turn that to useful advocacy and community organizing. And then the third thing I want to talk about is the role of the technology tools that communities use, and how we enable them to advocate to those tools, to use them to best advantage.
Powerful tool. It's very powerful when effectively used. A video is a powerful tool. It's very powerful when effectively used.
Communities can take control of that tool and share their own stories. The more stories, the more faces we put out there, the more difficult it is for people to trample their rights.
In a world where mobile technology is expanding, more and more citizens are empowered to tell their stories. The challenges are capturing video safely and making sure that the right people see it.
Millions of people now have very powerful communication technologies right at their fingertips. Witness' mission is to help anyone, anywhere, particularly poor and marginalized communities, to use those tools safely, ethically and effectively to amplify their voices, to level the playing field and to defend human rights.
Every day, people risk their lives to expose the truth. We provide the skills and the tools to help them protect themselves and the people they film.
Witness resources are helping citizens better capture and preserve footage that could one day serve as evidence of human rights abuses.
Graças aos materiais da Witness, nós estamos mais preparados para filmar e denunciar a violência policial que ocorre aqui no Brasil.
Witness ha posibilitado que nuestras comunidades utilicen el video para contar sus historias de una manera poderosa. Estas historias han inspirado a las personas a la acción y han resultado en justicia para las familias.
We see Witness's impact around the world, amplifying the voices of those who are fighting for change and shining a light on stories that need to be told.
Human stories do more than bring attention to an issue. They help us achieve justice. The people telling them deserve our support.
Spaces where we share this particularly are not simple spaces in terms of how the responses to individuals who share human rights footage take place, the retaliation that human rights activists face who share content online, the retaliation that ordinary individuals face when they express political viewpoints in the space. So we're very aware that this is a complicated arena. One thing I should say, and I think it's important if you're thinking about how do we tap into the power of citizen documentation against violence and hate and human rights violations, is to really think across the ecosystem. And we really try and think about that, and I'll try and illustrate that very concretely, is that you have to think, how do you empower someone who might only see something once, what we might describe as the accidental witness. We often hear about those in the case of police violence cases. People are like, wait, I never expected to be there. I ended up filming it. Suddenly I became the person at the center of a case. The community activists who do that on an ongoing monthly, weekly basis, and then the organized groups and networks, often human rights groups, groups coming out of communities that consistently document and advocate. How do we work between those different layers? In the case of Witness, these are some of my colleagues. You saw a couple of them in the video. All of our experiences try and be grounded very directly in the experiences of communities and activist groups on the ground. There are some blind spots in our work. We do a lot of work in the Americas, both in the US. We do a lot of work in the US where we're based, for the very important reason that there are many human rights violations there, and the US is responsible for many human rights violations in the world. We also do a lot of work in Latin America, in North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, MENA, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. We do less work in Western Europe in the last few years, and less work in Russia and China at the moment. And what we try and do, and I'll illustrate these in the examples I share, is work out how do you get skills out to hundreds of thousands of people within communities at risk. How do you work to test case what really makes a difference, right? So let's not just guess, let's really think about it. So what is it that makes a difference if you're a citizen on the ground documenting war crimes in Syria, if you want it to be evidence? What is it that makes a difference if you're trying to look at videos of violence against transgender or gender non-conforming people in the US who faced violence in the street? What do you need to do if you document? What do you need to do as an advocacy group? We do build technologies, and we advocate to tech companies. And as I said, I want to talk about that later, is like I think there's a really important role of people who are within communities that face human rights violations that are marginalized, of how do we enable them to advocate and to get their viewpoint expressed into some of the platforms everyone uses. So these are the 3 case studies I want to talk about. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about from the point of view of what is important to do as an individual who may be encountering hate crimes, violence. And here I'm going to look at it from the point of view of the person who films or documents it, and then makes a decision to potentially share it online, to provide it to a lawyer. All of those things that increasingly almost anyone could be in the position of doing, but particularly if you're within or a member of a community that is vulnerable, is more likely that you will be facing this need. Then I'm going to talk about a project called Capturing Hate, which is a project we worked on that looked at it from the other perspective, which is saying, and there's going to be some pretty horrible statistics I'm going to share, that there are thousands of videos online documenting, in this case, violence against transgender and gender non-conforming people in the subway, as you see in this image here, in a McDonald's restaurant, in a restroom, in the street, shared for all the wrong reasons. So shared by bystanders and witnesses who are cheering, encouraging it, sharing it in ways that are not because they care about the human rights violation, but because they think this is something funny or admirable that's just occurred. And this project was really trying to say, we know this is out there, we know that documentation and the videos we encounter in a space like YouTube or a more niche site like World Star Hip Hop are often shot for the wrong reasons. Can we turn that around and use that in a way that actually is data, can be used as advocacy, can help protect the rights of that community? And I think that's super important now. One of the things we often think about in our work is that the issue of there's a huge amount of volume of content. This is not about the isolated video. There are, in this case, thousands of pieces of documentation. So, as people who are coming from a perspective of trying to confront this type of hate and rights violation, how do we do that in a way that says, we know this is out there, can we turn it around? And then, as I said, I'm going to talk about our work engaging technology companies, because it really is very relevant to that. A lot of it is around issues of visibility, safety, and anonymity, and how do you provide the tools to communities to do that? And that's critical, right? It's, one perspective is how do you document this? One perspective is how do you make sense of it? The other is how do you protect people who are within this ecosystem, and how do you do that in an effective way? So I thought I'd start by placing the question of how do you document in a broader framework. So I'm going to give an example that's around documenting state violence first, and then I'm going to talk about documenting non-state violence. So the state violence I'm going to use is not from a hate crimes context, but it is a context of marginalization. And I'm going to share an example. I'll share a little short video clip to kind of give you a feel for it, and I'm going to share some of the guidance and tips that we provide in this type of context when people are thinking, what do I do if I encounter state violence as a community member? What should I do? And by state violence, I mean police, paramilitaries, could be security forces, paramilitary security forces. So this example is from Brazil. This is probably quite front and center for people over the last year because we just had the Rio Olympics last year. Fortunately, there were a few stories that talked about the other side of the Olympics, which is that as a consequence, and in the lead up to the Olympics, there was an increased militarization of favelas, favelas being the areas around the center of Rio, which are primarily poor, often Afro-Brazilian, historically marginalized areas. And so I'm going to show a short clip that illustrates how one group in that context thinks about documenting state violence.
Filmou em pé, pô, não dá. Manda pra mim.
Não, fuzil.
Não, eu acho que dá pra jogar assim, Renan.
Não, cara, expõe muito o sacolão. Expõe muito aqui o comércio do cara, dá pra ver que foi do comércio do cara, tá maluco?
Aqui, porque tá vendo? Ele tá na caída ainda.
Pega o fuzil, o primeiro pega o fuzil pega o fuzil do cana baleado.
Não, esse helicóptero.
Já tá
vai
dando.
dar?
Não, passa por... estará na outra base da Canitá. Ou então pode ir por trás no beco. A gente tem até brincado, quando a gente fala sobre esse trabalho algumas vezes, que a gente está com uma nova tecnologia inovadora de comunicação dentro da favela, mas que tem no celular de todo mundo. E aqui a gente tem muitas casas furadas, porque os policiais eles ficam naquela parte da mata, dando tiro para cá para baixo. Então por isso que a gente vê tantas casas furadas e tanta situação, porque é uma zona de muito confronto de ambas as forças armadas dentro do território.
Assim, essa localidade aqui foi onde aconteceu o caso do Eduardo, um menino de 10 anos.
A cena mais triste.
A cena mais triste, eu acho que de toda a atuação do complexo foi a cena mais triste. De que a gente chegar aqui e ver a galera, nesse pedacinho aqui, ver a galera desesperada, gritando. Que sem ter muito conhecimento, a galera já mesmo que achando que isso é instintivo, já entende o poder de um vídeo, do que o vídeo tem, né? Assim, caraca, graças a Deus, chegou alguém com uma câmera. Não, e tinha uma galera também aqui na janela que via as pessoas chegando e acenavam. É aqui, foi aqui. Então foi fácil achar.
So this sort of shows some of the context of how these events take place in the favelas. And I want to highlight a couple of the pieces of guidance that come out of this that are critical if you're working with a community that is confronting violence. You know, some of them are about what I would describe, and this is a Portuguese version. I've put a bunch of our resources over there. I didn't print out a lot because they're online. And I think for a Swedish audience, probably you can get online, but of course we also do them in a whole bunch of other formats for different constituencies and audiences. Some of it is about the challenges that always occur in state violence of did it actually occur? So like, you know, how do people document the details of who is responsible? The police car number, the badge on the individual. Some of it is documenting the location. And then the part that is, I want to emphasize most for this group is the safety side. So if you look to the example there, they're describing these people filming this horrendous killing that took place. Eduardo, 10-year-old boy, shot by the police forces. Some of the concerns they have there is, do we show on camera the other witnesses, right? Because when you show the other witnesses, you instantly implicate everyone else who could be targeted in that case. Do we share it immediately? Do we share it into a WhatsApp group? Do we share it publicly on Facebook? One piece of guidance we've seen in the US around police violence, and there have been a number of cases in the US over the last few years that have really put attention on police violence in the US. You know, the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. One particular one that I want to note, because I think it really goes to one of these questions around safety and impact with this type of footage. And by the way, this is a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's an American critic and writer, just reminding us, of course, that just because we're seeing it doesn't mean it didn't happen before. I think this is really important. We're noting that more people are documenting these events. This is not to say that suddenly things are surging. Certainly if you've been in a community that's faced violence, we know it's been happening historically. There was an incident, the Walter Scott killing, and I don't know if this was in the news in Sweden, but Walter Scott was a man who was shot while fleeing the police in North Carolina. He was shot 7 times in the back by a police officer. The police officer's account described it as being, they'd struggled, he'd been forced to shoot him. Now, what was interesting there is that the witness to that event, a man called Feidan Santana, didn't release the video straight away. He didn't put it straight up on Facebook. He didn't release it to the public straight away. He waited till the police account came out. And this is probably the most basic, simple piece of advice that we give within communities, is actually don't release straight away often. Think about the security side, right, who will be exposed, but also think about the question of the war of narratives, right? And when you're confronting state violence, the narrative power is on the side of the state, right? The state usually gets to say what happened, and then you get to disagree. And in this case, they waited till the report came out. So again, these types of sort of information, particularly when you're thinking at that first level of community members, right? The people who hopefully will not witness this every day of their lives, you know, the killing of their neighbors or their friends or their community members. Really thinking about very simple guidance that you can get out to many people is critical. We've been doing that a lot in the US, and I won't show the video, but you can see it online around the latest place where this is super important, which has been around immigration raids. So in the US, we've had since the beginning of the year a 40% increase in enforcement raids by ICE, which is the immigration authorities in the US, in a way that immigration advocates perceive as increasingly lawless, right? Despite the fact, of course, this is a state agency that should be law-abiding. And so there, a critical piece of advice is also around live streaming, right? So live streaming has been the space in which more and more people are sharing content. If you think about the security risks about live streaming directly, that's something to really bear in mind. And we do a lot of work on live streaming if that's an issue that people are really engaged on. I want to talk about, as a final point in this sort of area, and point people to this resource, which is the work we've been doing around hate crimes and documenting hate crimes. In the US, we've seen a surge in ethnicity and religion-based hate crimes, or perceived ethnicity and perceived religion-based hate crimes. And of course, we have an ongoing pattern of violence against LGBTQ, gender non-conforming individuals in the US and other minorities. And you'll see that, in fact, the sort of the baseline of advice you provide in these contexts is relatively consistent. That's what I want to emphasize, is trying to, you know, not to overcomplicate it when you're trying to work with communities of potential witnesses. So safety first, right? How do you minimize the potential for repercussions for the individuals involved? How do you emphasize proving it's real with very simple measures? Doesn't need to be complicated. Identification of perpetrator, location. How do you film so others understand? This sounds obvious, but when you've encountered a lot of online footage where it's very unclear what just happened, this is very important. Think before you share. This is this very critical piece of advice. There's a default assumption that, wait, I should just put that online. That is a dangerous assumption. It's not always incorrect, right? We're not saying don't put it online, but thinking about that. And then technically, of course, backing up content. This, of course, also relates to the fact, particularly if you're encountering state violence, that often officers will take your device. They don't necessarily have the right to do that, but it's quite likely someone will delete content if they believe it's incriminating. So first set of sort of ways to approach this, coming from the perspective of working with communities of witnesses, to really think, how do you engage them around and across this range of options? Second thing I want to talk about is the place that many of you might be in, or colleagues working in in the context of advocacy or community-based organizations is you're not necessarily filming this, right? You might be working with the communities of witnesses, but you're encountering this content either because constituents, members, community members say, wait a second, I just shot this or I just found this. So we spend a lot of time working out, well, what do you do to make sense of that content? I'm gonna just mention some of this briefly, and if we want to, we could go into this in the workshop section. We have a lot of guidance to help people think through how to do this if you're in this position. So ethical guidelines for understanding how to make those decisions. You know, if someone sends you a clip of video that shows an act of graphic violence directed on the basis of gender or gender identity or ethnicity, but you don't have the context of where it occurred, you don't know the filmer, you don't know the victim, the person who's affected, you know, how do you make good decisions about that? And this is increasingly for human rights groups a situation they're placed in, right? Is they're not the ones filming it, it's not a professional researcher, it's not even a long-standing community member sometimes, it's anonymous footage or an eyewitness. So how do we think about that? And how do we think about our responsibility to share this? A good example of responsibility to share that I think is quite visible in LGBTQ advocacy was in Russia last year. There was a pattern of people sharing videos online where they had lured other individuals into dates or meetings and then had abused them and filmed it and shared it online. So, and these were being shared very heavily, you know, as groups maybe working on LGBTQ rights or human rights advocacy. How do we look at these videos? How do we share them? How do we use them in a context where this, you know, and I've shared a couple of the least offensive videos and least personally humiliating because you can identify individuals. Because they are, of course, when you share this video again, you're re-victimizing for probably the third time, right? So there's a victimization as someone is filmed. There is a victimization that is the physical act that is taking place, of course. And then there is a victimization of the resharing and the constant pattern around that, which we've seen consistently. So in the report I'm about to talk about, the Capturing Hate report, consistently people who faced violence as transgender or gender non-conforming individuals talked about their horror at the ongoing way in which these videos were shared. Often 5, 6 years later, you know, online videos of the assault on them were visible, being shared, being commented on, being used. So that sort of re-victimization level. And I'll say, I won't go further into kind of thinking through the guidelines here, but to say if we want to workshop that, I have some materials for us to do a workshopping section around that afterwards if we want to. But you know, like how do we answer the questions like around that content there where, for example, you're a journalist or an advocate and an LGBTQ activist alerts you to those videos. You know, what should you do with that content? How should you share that? What are the decisions you would make? And what would be the framework to think that through as an individual? And of course, this issue has been very much at the forefront at the moment recently around other types of content like extremist content. So if certainly very front and center for a lot of governments right now is how do they manage extremist content online? Similar questions come up if you're thinking, well, there's extremist content, how do I use that in a way that counters that message? Not from a state perspective, from a community advocacy or activist perspective. So I want to talk about this project next because I think it's a really interesting way to think about, you know, the really big challenge that so much of this content isn't shot for the right reasons, right? So I'm describing in the first section of this, like, well, what if you have community members who really want to document violence and hate crimes? How do you help them do that? Well, what about community members who really want to film violence and hate crimes because it's cool to film violence and hate crimes and they support what just happened, or they think it's funny, or they don't care, right? Which is probably equally prevalent. Hard to know, but certainly similarly prevalent. So I want to talk about the Capturing Hate report. This came out of our Witness Media Lab that tries to do kind of sort of approaches to taking new ways to deal with online video, online rights violations captured on video. And I'll start with a story. I'm not going to show much video in this because a lot of these videos are humiliating and graphic. I'll tell you a little bit of a story. I've got a screen grab there that is from one of the videos. So this was, you'll see in this video that an individual is being dragged across the floor. And the video that is underlying this opens with, kind of a pan across it. So you look and there are two people in the corner and they're screaming and shouting. And then the footage comes into focus and the two women are leaning forward facing a wall. And then you see that they're basically stamping on someone. They're assaulting someone who's lying on the floor. And they do that repeatedly. And then they end up dragging the woman across the floor. And this was a woman called Chrissy Polish. She was transgender, and she was assaulted leaving a restroom in McDonald's in Maryland about 6 or 7 years ago. And it was filmed by a McDonald's employee and shared online that day to a number of websites. It had 500,000 views by the end of the evening of a graphic assault on an individual. And since then has had around, I think it's around 7 million views across websites. And the reason I share that is it's probably like, one of the most iconic examples of this type of violence, but it's not unrepresentative. It was filmed by someone who, the accidental witness, the McDonald's employee. It was shared onto social networks. It was shared on YouTube and World Star Hip Hop, and it was shared obviously from those into social media networks like Facebook and Twitter and others like that. And it was shared in celebration of what was happening. And I think this is a pattern that we see recurringly. So the Capturing Hate report was an attempt to say, there's a real challenge actually around documenting violence against transgender people in the US. The statistics are not well kept because often there are a number of reasons for that. People choose not to report crimes because they don't trust the reaction of law enforcement to them. Some law enforcement agencies in the US do not collect this type of data and are not particularly willing to. And also many types of reporting around hate crimes are binary based, right? So they assume a gender binary, which may not capture that this is the violence towards transgender, gender non-conforming or gender non-binary individuals. So working with groups like the Anti-Violence Project and the Trans People of Color Coalition in the US, we said, well, is there a way we could try and confront this data challenge and come up with advocacy information from the types of footage like the Chrissy Polish video? Because there's this gap. So let's try and do, and I don't know if anyone here is familiar with like judo and jujitsu, right? How do you turn the opponent's strength against them? So how do we turn this volume of hateful video into something that can be used, in fact, pro-transgender and gender non-conforming individuals? So I'm going to put a trigger warning on this video that it does contain transphobic language and portray not very directly some acts of violence against individuals, but it'll explain what we did in the report.
I think that there's not been enough research into showing what the real trans experience is like. It's been great for this project that we were able to get data to show that the violence tracks with what really is happening in the world.
For there to be a report where you found hundreds of these videos that people are regularly posting on all kinds of sites, I mean, that tells us something very different about what's happening around violence against trans folks, I think, than what is out there right now. For many people, these videos in and of themselves are sort of a secondary act of violence.
And so when our community watches itself being beaten and killed and told they're no good and they're horrible, the sites help perpetuate self-hate Not only that, but they help others to hate us and to perpetuate myths and stereotypes. I mean, the hate comments are just horrifying. This is what some of the comments are like. If you see crazy tranny coming at you, don't fight it. You might catch AIDS, just shoot it. This is a preview of what will happen to trannies in women's restrooms. Kill that fucking tranny. They're not just targeted at those victims in the videos. They're targeted at all trans people, all gender non-conforming people.
There needs to be more attention paid to these videos and how they're being used. If they're being put out as entertainment, I would really like to think about how do we disrupt that conversation, right? Both on an educational level and also a policy level.
And I've brought a couple of, like one copy of the report, but certainly accessible online on the Witness website. I'll talk a little bit from a technical side about how we did the work, and then I'll talk about what we found and what you can do with that type of information. And what I want to emphasize with this is, again, we think this type of methodology is applicable to other types of violence against minority groups. So we worked on violence against trans people, which certainly does have more of this entertainment dimension to it, sadly, than in some other contexts. But we've talked with, within Witness, to our colleagues working on issues like around gender-based violence in Mexico, looking at sectarian violence in Southeast Asia, where you have similar patterns of celebrating violence towards minority groups. So certainly as through the lens of whatever work you do or whatever you're engaged in, think about how this could be relevant, because we see this as a methodology and an approach that sadly will be necessary in a whole bunch of different areas. So technically, at first we wanted to focus on US only. We wanted to try and work out how to put a scope on it. Some realizations, of course, online it's very hard to work out what is geography. The other thing we found is that engagement is global on these videos. So videos that are shot in one location are engaged with by constituencies globally. The level is huge, right? So you see assaults, verbal humiliation, bullying, video game assaults shared online. So so people assaulting trans-identified or gender non-conforming individuals in video games and then sharing them online. All the way through to physical assault and murder. We only focused on physical assault and beyond. Simply because of the scope and scale, it was impossible to look at like a range of that. And the way we focused on trying to understand it was really trying to look at the engagement data. So, how do you understand how people engage with this content? Because that's what's really important for telling us from both the societal perspective. We certainly had challenges. How do you define acts of violence? How do you determine whether content is transphobic? How do you think about entertainment versus advocacy? And certainly questions that we were not prescriptive around race and gender identity, right? You cannot make assumptions based on an online video on someone's race or gender identity, or you cannot make categoric assumptions. And all of these have ramifications. So for example, defining acts of violence becomes relevant, for example, when you're looking at like what place videos like this have on a space like YouTube, right? So YouTube, and I'll talk about that in a moment, has a lot of videos like this. YouTube allows fight videos on YouTube, right? You can share a fight video on YouTube. It's legitimate content. You can't have hate crimes. So how do you show that a video was not shared and it's not purely like a, hey, two people wanted to have a fight? No, it's an assault in which is aggravated by the fact, for example, that what transgender and gender non-conforming people describe as the experience of walking while trans, right? That as you are in the streets, that there is a sense of threat from many individuals because of your identity. So scope is everything. Just a quick shot of like, an Excel sheet that shows what happens when you start to scrape this content. And these were the numbers. So even within the subset, so stripping this down to a relatively contained subset on 4 platforms, YouTube, WorldStar Hip Hop, LiveLeak, and FlyHeight. I'm guessing folks are probably, well, people know YouTube. You may know LiveLeak, sort of more like shock content generally, often war crimes, stuff like that, if that's your thing that you look on websites for. World Star Hip Hop and Fly Height are more niche channels where a lot of this content is found. We used just 2 search terms eventually, tranny fight and stud fight, which were the most reflective of how people were terming these in this type of entertainment sharing. 329 videos, 89 million views, 600,000 shares, 500,000 likes, overwhelmingly positive responses to the content. You know, that gives you a little more sense of the balance there between the two there. And you know, there's a number of ways you can represent how people engage with this. You know, this is, you know, what a word cloud looks like. Overwhelmingly offensive terms describing the context of what happens. You know, defining gender in the binary, conflating gender identity with sexual orientation, observing about what constitutes a real man or woman, and also racist critiques of black urban culture and African American culture in the US. Because in many of these videos it is trans people of color who are being targeted, who are particularly vulnerable to this type of assault. And again, you know, across these platforms, you know, lots of videos on YouTube, small minority of the content, significant numbers of videos with high views on World Star Hip Hop and Fly Height, a much more prominent part of those platforms. So YouTube, which is interesting, and this is a place where we've been engaging with YouTube around it, is that there's of course a YouTube policy that expressly forbids content that promotes violence or hatred. But YouTube, this is a niche content area. By contrast, something like World Star Hip Hop, this is their bread and butter, honestly. The bread and butter of these sites are shock videos of fights, abuse, and exploitation. They don't have a policy on hate crimes. They're only concerned with copyright infringement. You know, and you can see there that although we found 47 videos there, this is a much smaller site and had 65 million views on those videos. I should say the videos are largely the same across the site, so it's not like there is a niche in terms of what type of offensive violence is shared on any given site. So that they're relatively consistent, and you see some. And this was from Fly Height, and this is a particularly offensive video that shows 2 women who were assaulted on a train in Atlanta, and one was stripped naked as part of the assault. And you can see kind of what people made of the video. They have this rather charming emoji-based approach where LOL was 24%, shocked was 13%, disgusted was 0%. Yeah. So this is what you're seeing in this type of content. And we had to grapple with when is it hate speech? And we looked at all of these different types of approaches. Where is it placed in a channel? What are the comments? What is the engagement like depending on what a particular channel works on? And as I mentioned at the start, one thing to bear in mind is, and you notice it in these videos, is frequently people are saying things like going viral or World Star Hip Hop as they film. So the intentionality is to share it for virality. And this obviously raises much bigger questions that we could grapple with around, you know, how do we understand people, you know, is there a way to change that sort of bystander culture to a more positive way than it exists right now? Because certainly this is a bystander culture that's about voyeurism and kind of monetizing your video of someone else's abuse. This is super small. I need to split this into 2 screens. Apologies. But it reiterates some of the things I'm saying. You know, 2/3 of the videos found on YouTube, but 70% of the total views were on World Star Hip Hop. There is brand advertising alongside this, which is one place that I think is, as we think from an advocacy perspective, is worth targeting. Is, you know, in the US, I don't think State Farm Insurance, Heineken, and Applebee's, which is a kind of family restaurant chain, particularly want to be monetized alongside assaults on trans people. Ongoing engagement, so I mentioned the Chrissy Pollis video, 7 years on, that's still being engaged with in a massive way. So these are, in the sickest way, evergreen videos. they tell us some of the questions that, or they reinforce some of the understanding of how trans and gender non-conforming people are stigmatized, you know, questioning gender, a gender binary, characteristics of real men or women, and conflating sexual orientation and gender identity. And I want to re-emphasize what I said in terms of this question of the ethical obligation to share. Is, you know, Bev Tillery, who you saw in the video, says for many people the existence of these videos is a secondary act of violence. So how do you give people control over it? So let me talk a few things. I'm going to share a couple of the ways we think this type of approach can be used by similar organizations or groups working in this space. So we would love to see others in the LGBTQ space looking at this and trying to think how to use this data. You know, one is, let me start with the very individual case. So we've already seen this data used, for example, to seal a legal name change petition in the US when an attorney was trying to prove the stigma and the violence associated with being transgender or transgender in the US. So there are very simple ones where it's like, how do you use this as a data source when there's no data at the federal or state level, right? So when the state refuses to come up with good data, and you could see the analogies in other places that have violence towards minorities, right? There's not great data on violence against religious minorities in Indonesia. I don't know what the similar parallel would be here in Sweden, but I bet there are some gaps in the state data gathering that could be addressed in a similar way. Another is to think, how do you use the type of search methodology we use to find videos to help individual victims find the videos and request they be taken down, right? So as a human rights organization, we don't believe that all these videos should be taken down. We don't want to censor the internet in terms of all videos that show physical violence. And in fact, we spend quite a lot of time engaging companies like YouTube about keeping some types of content like this up because it's important evidence. For example, in a very different context in Syria with war crimes evidence recently, a lot of channels showing that have been taken down. So we're not going to YouTube and saying take down every video that might potentially show violence against transgender or gender non-conforming people. But certainly as an individual affected by this, you should absolutely know how to search for a video, and if you have a privacy or a rights violation claim, to be able to make that as an individual. So those are very individualized levels in which this type of methodology can help individuals working in that. As advocacy organizations, we're seeing it used as data. So how do you use this to make an advocacy claim around either in terms of legal protections or cultural advocacy as well, right? So there are important dimensions to think about here about how culture has turned this into entertainment. So how do we advocate around that in the cultural space? And then for journalists and media organizations, how do they responsibly share this? And this ties back to some of the work we do on the ethical guidelines. And then, as I said, for the technology companies, we've been in an active dialogue, particularly with YouTube, around how they handle this. There are some interesting things that have been happening recently where they are, for example, taking the ability to comment and monetize off types of content that they don't necessarily want to take down but believe shouldn't be monetized. And we hope we can see that extended to some of these types of videos, which is, it's fine, you can share this, but you don't get to monetize violence against someone in a rights violation type context. So there are ways to do it which allow freedom of expression, retain the ability to use this as data, right? Because you can similarly use these videos in cases, right? You can use them to prosecute individuals, but to find a way where the monetization, the entertainment value is taken away from them. So I want to wrap up just by talking a little bit about that company engagement as well as a final dimension, because as you'll notice, almost all this is happening within big technology companies and platforms. And similarly for the constituencies we were describing at the beginning, so the people who are filming hate crimes as individuals, they are filming and they're sharing in the Brazil context to WhatsApp, Facebook. In the US, you know, YouTube, Snapchat, Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp. So people are using these platforms whether we like it or not. So a couple of places where we're trying to think about how you engage the platforms. And these are areas that emerge frequently when we're talking with communities of activists and engaging with them. And so I'll talk about these, and then as I say, the other workshop thing we could workshop after this would be to talk around, you know, how to think about this, how to understand how as a community-based advocate you could engage in trying to shape the platforms. So privacy and risk management, proof and verification, how do you ethically curate these live stories, you know, as a platform, and live video, which is super complicated from all these ethical perspectives. Let me talk a little bit about what we've done around the first, and I'll do it through an illustrative example. In the early days of the Syrian revolution, so this was back in the days where there were street protests, rather than the current context of a civil war and an active conflict with multiple parties. We were working with groups on the ground, looking at videos, giving advice on a number of different areas. And we would see videos like this that were very crudely trying to protect the identities of individuals in a protest. This was a children's protest, actually, that took place, and they just did this kind of sort of blurring of faces. And this was something that we were familiar with, right? If you work in human rights video, you know that one of the biggest challenges is someone speaks out on video, and guess what? You can see their face. And guess what? Individuals, if that video has reached an impact, will look and try and find that individual and punish them. It's almost inevitable corollary of speaking out, of which, of course, there is an underlie of how do you help people understand that risk and make the decision. And we would also hear this from individuals, so individuals who had been at a street protest and were then at would be stopped at a checkpoint, and an individual would show them an image taken from YouTube of them at the protest, because the Syrian authorities, much like authorities worldwide, monitor social media for content. This is from the Green Revolution in Iran, very similar early attempt to do this, where they publicly shared images of protesters during the Green Revolution. And as I said, we've known this for a long time, that you have to think about this element. So this was a video shared by a witness to gender-based violence during the elections in Zimbabwe. So women who are aligned with the MDC and opposition parties targeted for, with gender-based violence. And as I mentioned before, we've seen it in the context of perpetrator video, like these videos from Russia. So the question then becomes, well, you know, how do you think about enabling people to do this better? And one of the questions that we learned from talking to individuals in Syria and elsewhere about why they hadn't blurred the faces was very simple. They were like, I don't know how to do it, and I couldn't do it easily, right? And I'm pretty willing to, if I asked most of you, now it's interesting, if I asked you now if you knew how to blur a face, I think some people here would probably know how to do it on their mobile device. If you asked 5 years ago, if I'd have done a poll in the witness office, I think I'd have had like a lot of people going, you know, because there wasn't an easy answer. And so like the expectation that people would blur faces was unrealistic, right? If you don't have the tools to do that in the platforms you use, how are you going to do that in a meaningful way? The way we approached it was twofold. We first, and this is something we often do, we built our own technology to do it. So we built a tool called ObscuraCam that enabled you to blur faces and blur videos, and quite widely used. We also advocated to YouTube to say, look, you should build something similar into the platform. And I think this is really important, and I don't know how many of you come from a technology background or an open source background. You know, there's always within the activist community a real controversy about the choice between open source and commercial platforms. And it's a very real controversy, and with lots of good rationales behind it. And at Witness, we work on both, so we work on open source technologies, but we also know that 95% of the people we work with are on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Snapchat. And so it is the ethical choice to try and shift those platforms as well as try and build alternatives. And so we worked with them on a blurring function. I'll explain that one in a second. That is not a human rights image. To develop a blurring feature, which we've continued to work with them on to try and think what is actually what you need. So for example, they first launched a blurring feature that blurred all the faces in a video. Well, that's probably not what you need in a sense for a human rights purpose, because you blur the perpetrator's face, you blur everything. What you need to do is be able to blur out particular faces in a piece of content and share it. You know, for example, from those videos of assaults on transgender individuals or LGBTQ teenagers in Russia, you might decide you only need to blur the faces of the survivors and the victims. You obviously aren't going to blur the faces of perpetrators, but you might decide to blur them all. Again, like you have to think about, you know, what are the affordances of the platform. And they just launched actually one just last week, a new version of it that is selective face blur, so you can see it from this. You can choose, uses face recognition to identify all the faces in the video and to track them, and then you pick which face you want. So this is actually a video from Cambodia in which we're just blurring those two individuals' faces. And that's what you want to be able to do, ideally, is to have that flexibility to do those kinds of things. Now, the reason I showed this image before of the, what's that? What's happened on that photo? What have I used on that? Yeah, so that's a Snapchat or a Facebook filter. And so it's interesting, we're now at a point where, in fact, you can blur faces or do something similar in Snapchat and Facebook. You may not blur them, you may put like a dragon mask on it, you may do something like that. So a lot of our own push at the moment is actually around the sort of AR filter side of it, as much as the sort of traditional blur, because that's also the way that consumers use it, right? So everyone knows how to do well, a lot of people know how to do a Snapchat filter, right? So it's a lot easier to help people understand how to use that than something that's different, right? So always try and think, how do you go with the flow of the tool versus try and persuade people to do something they've never thought of doing before. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk too much about the proof and verification side. I would say it's equally important, right? So at the same time as we want to protect the identity of individuals, use this type of content ethically, there are often significant challenges, and this is in a moment where fake news is kind of the buzzword around videos. And we spend a lot of work on that. I'm happy to talk about it with folks afterwards, trying to think, what are the things you can do? I mentioned some of them earlier, like, film the location, film identifying marks, and, in a state unit. And then there are also technical things you can do that can address that. And that's something we've been working on, trying to think how you build what we describe as a proof mode, which is a way that anyone can opt in to creating more trustworthy media. So you might film something that is important as evidence, like an assault. You might share the most trustworthy version to a lawyer, and you might blur the version you share publicly, is actually what you want to encourage people to do, is think, create trustworthy media, but you can fork, right? It's important to remember that, is you don't need to share just the same version to everyone. And I think that's an important piece of guidance that we're often working with people on. Let me end with just one note, which is, I mentioned earlier, which is that, there is a complicated dance with these technology companies about what content should stay up and down. I think it's very visible right now around extremist content, right? So I don't know what the dialogue has been like in Sweden around extremist content online. I suspect it's been one where the government is pushing back at it. Certainly in the US and the UK, as two places that are leading on this, and in Germany, there is a lot of pressure to take down what is perceived as extremist content. And then you can also imagine the context we were describing earlier around violence against transgender people and those videos of assaults, where quite rightly some groups are like, just take it all down, right? They're like, just take all this content down. And so how do we make sure that there's some kind of balance in this process, and that some of the rights of freedom of expression and visibility are there? And so just as a note, like recently, and this relates to some of the threats as well in this space, YouTube has a new AI, artificial intelligence algorithm that took down a lot of the extremist content from YouTube. What that meant was they also took down thousands of videos that showed war crimes evidence from Syria, because they show horrible things from a place that is perceived as being extremist. Or one video came up with a flag because it contained a flag, for example, of an extremist unit, but they're documenting what's happening. So the question then becomes, how do you help try and protect those? And this is a very open question right now, and as individuals, and I don't know everyone's background in the room here who might be thinking about kind of what content you want to see online and what you don't. I think it's a really important moment to be engaging and pushing back on some of the companies, because at the moment there is a big pressure to clean those spaces in the interests of government pressure and commercial pressure. And there are goodwill impulses within the companies as well to do things to protect some of this content. So we're having a pretty productive dialogue around some of this content now. But it takes civil society pressure as well in every country that's facing these pushbacks. As I mentioned, Live puts all of this in a very complex framework. I'm not going to talk in great depth about that, but just think about the issues of exposure, right? So if I'm suggesting earlier, you might want to share a piece of content a day later after the police account has come out, well, you don't have that option if you shared it live, right? At the same time, you might be questioning police accountability in the moment, and the most iconic example, sadly, in the US was the case of Diamond Reynolds, who filmed on Facebook Live the shooting of her partner, Philando Castile, and he dies sitting next to her as she films him on Facebook Live. And raised all kinds of questions about, like, well, you know, should we be encouraging individuals to do this type of filming? You know, how do you manage the trade-offs and help people understand the trade-offs? And that's the question, is you're never being prescriptive about this, but helping people understand what will actually make a difference for them as an individual or their community is critical. So I wanted to sort of wrap up there. I think it would be good to take a break and then talk. I have a couple of different workshop ideas if people want to workshop some things afterwards, but we're also a small group, so maybe I'll come back after. Are we taking a short break now? What's that? Let's take a short break. I'll tell you 2 ideas I have for workshopping, but I'm really open to what people want to work through, and I'd love to hear more about the backgrounds of you guys, not on live stream, so you don't have to publicly state who you are on live stream. But 2 ideas for workshopping. One is really about this question of how do we design the tools like Facebook and YouTube in a way that supports marginalized communities and human rights usages, so a set of questions to work through. And then I have another workshop which is around really thinking about the choices we make to share images and to present them. So depending on the direction the group wants to take, we can go in either of those.